2 suspects, 1 face, 0 alibis. Welcome to Faded Echoes. I am your host, Ombra. Tell me, where in the world are you unraveling this from? It means so much having you here. Many men have done so, Mr. Grimble, Holmes said quietly, and some have lost. He turned back to the desk. Now, let us speak plainly. A briefcase contained something that someone was willing to steal by force and deception. You will. Tell me what it was, or I shall deduce it and make a great nuisance of myself in the process. Grimble's jaw worked silently for a moment. Then he sighed. Very well. The briefcase contained documents pertaining to the estate of the late Lord Everton, specifically new codicils that would alter the inheritance in a significant fashion. Holmes' eyes glittered. Go on. It was on a dreary March morning in the year 1897 that the curious affair of the identical suspects first crossed the threshold of our humble quarters at 221B Baker Street. London, cloaked in its familiar shroud of fog, had slipped into one of its more melancholy moods. I had just returned from a short visit to my practice in Paddington, where I had been attending to a man suffering from an affliction more of the spirit than of the body. Holmes, as ever, sat by the hearth in his silk dressing-gown, eyes half-lidded but mind undoubtedly whirring, his long, slender fingers steepled beneath his chin. You have returned 20 minutes later than anticipated, he murmured as I entered without turning his gaze from the crackling fire. Your patient had company an elder brother, recently arrived from Bournemouth. A retired naval officer, I suspect. His gait would be uneven from an old leg wound, and you surely paused to help him down the stairs. I dropped my hat on the stand with a soft thud. Holmes, that is absolutely correct. But how? He waved a hand dismissively. You still carry the scent of pipe tobacco, of a peculiar blend I've only encountered in the Royal Navy Club lounge, coupled with a trace of salt water on your boots, likely from the soles of his own. This deduction required no great effort. Before I could mount a reply, Mrs. Hudson's footfall echoed up the stairs, and a firm knock came at the door. A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes. He says it is a matter of some urgency. Show him in, Holmes called. Watson, I believe. The day's amusement has finally arrived. The man who entered was in his early 40s, trim and clean-shaven, with a military bearing, not unlike that of my recent acquaintance. He wore a gray morning coat of some expense, though a dark smear of something oily sullied the cuff of his right sleeve. His face was pale, drawn, and carried an expression of profound bewilderment. My name is Major Alistair Forsyth, he began after seating himself, removing his gloves with trembling fingers. Mr. Holmes, I've come to you on the recommendation of Colonel Thomas Sefton, whose affairs you once resolved most discreetly in '94. Holmes inclined his head. The matter of the vanishing emerald, a delightful conundrum. What troubles you, Major Forsyth? The man hesitated. I'm, sir, accused of a most despicable crime, assault, theft, and unlawful impersonation. The trouble is, I am innocent. And yet all evidence and all witnesses claim I was at the scene. He leaned forward, eyes wide. But I could not have been. I was with my sister in Sussex at the very time the crime was committed. There are signed letters, dated telegrams, even a church register confirming my presence at a charity auction in Eastbourne. And yet he swallowed. 3 witnesses in London, one of them, a police constable, swear it was I who assaulted a man in Cheapside and made off with his briefcase. Holmes' eyes glittered. How very curious. Pray continue. The man I'm alleged to have attacked is a certain Mr. Osric Grimble, a solicitor of middling repute. I have never met him, and yet he described me in precise detail, my height, my mustache, the scar on my temple, even the limp in my left leg from the India campaign. Watson and I exchanged a glance. Could it be a case of mistaken identity? I asked. Forsyth shook his head. Inspector Lestrade, who is handling the matter, is convinced of my guilt. He has advised me to confess, says it will go easier for me. But Mr. Holmes, I swear to you, I was not in London that night. And yet the evidence insists I was. For a long moment Holmes said nothing. He tapped his long index, finger against the armrest in a slow rhythm. Finally he asked, Have you any enemies, Major Forsyth? A man of means and military standing may have drawn the ire of many. None that would stoop to such bizarre mimicry. Unless, he paused, unless you count my brother. At this Holmes' brows rose. Ah, a brother. Forsyth shifted uneasily. Gideon Forsyth, my identical twin. That gave us all pause. I sat upright. You have a twin? I said. You didn't think to mention this earlier? We've been estranged for over a decade. I hadn't thought. I hadn't believed he would do such a thing. Forsyth's voice wavered. We were once close, but Gideon, he changed. Dabbled in questionable investments, fell in with gamblers. We quarreled. He vanished from my life years ago. I thought him somewhere abroad in disgrace. Holmes stood abruptly and went to the window. The morning mist swirled like the specters of a half-forgotten dream. And yet, he murmured, someone bearing your precise appearance has committed a very precise crime. Too precise, one might say. Tell me, Major, what was in the briefcase that was stolen? Forsyth hesitated. That I do not know. Grimble refuses to disclose it to the police. Claims it was confidential client material. Holmes smiled. Cold and sharp. A solicitor who shields the contents of a briefcase even after being attacked. How very illuminating. Watson, you will accompany me to Cheapside. There is something in this that smells not only of deception, but of deliberate orchestration. He turned back to the Major. And you, sir, must do absolutely nothing. Remain at your club. Answer no further police inquiries. Speak to no reporters. The game, he said, voice low and charged, is most certainly afoot. Holmes was already donning his Inverness cape by the time I collected my walking stick. The fog outside clung to the cobbles like ash, muffling the sound of passing hansoms as we stepped into the gray morning. He hailed a cab with a sharp whistle. To Cheapside, he instructed crisply. Corner of Basing Lane. We rode in silence for a few moments, the horses' hooves thudding rhythmically on the damp street. Then I ventured, Holmes, do you truly believe the Major's twin brother is behind this? I believe, he said, that we are dealing with a scenario more complex than mere impersonation. A twin makes for an excellent misdirection, a natural sleight of hand. But too convenient, don't you think? The timing, the witnesses, the nature of the crime, this has the signature of orchestration. But surely, I said, if there are 2 identical men and only one of them committed the crime, It's just a matter of finding the right one." Holmes offered a thin smile. "My dear Watson, when one identical man is known to society, and the other is a shadow, the shadow may act with impunity, so long as it remains just that. But I suspect this shadow wants very much to be seen." The cab pulled to a halt, and we alighted onto the slick pavement. Cheapside was bustling despite the fog, its shop fronts busy with clerks, porters, and the usual din of commerce. Holmes moved with purpose, weaving through the crowd until we reached a modest brick building with brass signage, Osric, Grimble, and Associates. Solicitors dot inside. The receptionist, a round man with nervous eyes, barely had time to rise before Holmes was upon him. "Mr. Grimble, please," he said. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. We are expected." The man blinked. I beg your pardon, sir, but Mr. Grimble hasn't mentioned." Holmes raised a hand. "He will wish to see us." "Tell him it concerns Major Forsyth." That did the trick. The receptionist scurried off, returning a minute later to wave us through. Grimble's office was dimly lit, its windows heavy with grime and curtains only half drawn. The solicitor stood as we entered, a lean, nervous fellow in his 50s, with a face like a crumpled ledger and fingers that twitched constantly. "Mr. Holmes, I was not aware you'd taken on Major Forsyth's defense." "I have taken on the case," Holmes replied, ignoring the offered handshake. "Not the defense." A subtle but important distinction. "Tell me, Mr. Grimble, do you make it a habit to conceal stolen items from the police?" Grimble flushed. "The briefcase contained sensitive materials, confidential to my client." "And who is this client?" Grimble hesitated. "I'm afraid I cannot say." Holmes nodded slowly, as if expecting this answer. He began to pace the small room, examining the shelves and framed diplomas with idle interest. Then, abruptly, "Did the assailant speak? Excuse me? During the attack, did he say anything?" "Curse, demand the briefcase, threaten you?" Grimble blinked. "Yes," he said. "You've meddled long enough, Grimble." Then he struck me. I fell, and by the time I regained my senses, the case was gone. Holmes nodded again, then turned toward the window, parting the curtain with 2 fingers. "And the police found no signs of forced entry?" "There was none." He followed me into the foyer and struck as I turned the latch. "Curious," Holmes murmured. "Very curious. And you are certain it was Major Forsyth?" "Absolutely. I've seen him before he handled some land disputes for a friend of mine years ago. I would stake my life on it. A young man named Reginald Everton's second cousin, once removed, stands to gain a substantial portion of the estate, including a Surrey property. The changes were to be registered this week. And who currently benefits under the old will? Primarily a nephew by marriage, Lionel Beckwith. Holmes was still. "Ah, and where does Mr. Beckwith reside?" "Mayfair, number 14, Cooper Street. But I assure you, he's no man of violence." Holmes smiled faintly. "Assurances are rarely reliable currency in my profession. Thank you, Mr. Grimble. That will be all for now." We departed in silence, Holmes striding ahead with a fierce determination. Once outside, he spoke. "We must visit Cooper Street." "You suspect this Beckwith?" "I suspect anyone with something to lose. But more than that, I suspect a performance." "A performance?" "Yes. Think, Watson. Why would a man so perfectly resembling Major Forsyth rob a solicitor of inheritance documents that do not directly benefit either Forsyth brother? It makes no sense unless the resemblance itself is the point. You mean to draw suspicion? Exactly. Someone wanted Major Forsyth implicated. Someone who knew of the twin, knew of their estrangement, and had the resources to orchestrate a convincing attack. But who would go to such lengths? Holmes hailed another cab. That is what we must now discover. Either Gideon Forsyth has returned with a vengeance, or someone has found a very clever way to wear his face. As the cab trundled through the misty streets toward Mayfair, I considered the strange facts thus far: the twin brother lost to time, the solicitor who withheld information, the mysterious briefcase, and the perfect identification by witnesses. It all pointed toward something larger, something woven together with a calculated precision that sent a cold shiver down my spine. Holmes, beside me, was silent, but I saw the tightening of his jaw and the glint in his eye. The machine of his mind was fully engaged now, and I knew we were in the midst of something intricate and potentially very dangerous. And still a question lingered in the fog between. You is not Forsyth, then, who had struck Grimble? And more chilling still, why make it look so much like him? The cab deposited us just before noon on Cooper Street, a handsome stretch of Mayfair marked by tall windows and porticoed entrances, the fog having lifted just enough to reveal the symmetrical grandeur of the neighborhood. Holmes stepped lightly onto the pavement and studied number 14 with a dispassionate air, as though he were examining a specimen in a petri dish rather than the residence of a potential conspirator. Note the windows. Watson. Second-floor curtains drawn, yet no lamp burning behind them. Either the occupant is absent or wishes to appear so. The door was answered after only a single knock by a man in a crisp black coat and white gloves, clearly a valet, with the pale skin and stillness of someone accustomed to being neither seen nor heard. Mr. Lionel Beckwith, Holmes announced. Is at home, I presume? The valet's eyes flicked to Holmes' lapel, where his watch chain glinted faintly. He is, sir, but indisposed at present. Holmes offered a courteous smile, which rarely meant anything courteous at all. Kindly inform Mr. Beckwith that Mr. Sherlock Holmes is here to speak with him on a matter involving the late Lord Everton's estate. I assure you he will want to hear it. The man hesitated only a moment before bowing and disappearing inside. Moments later we were shown into a drawing-room filled with a wealth of eclectic possessions, Japanese screens, oil portraits in heavy frames, and a scent of something floral and artificial. Lionel Beckwith entered soon after, a tall man with thinning blonde hair and a face that wore the signs of irritation poorly. I don't know what this is about, he said without preamble, but I suppose I must hear you out if you insist. On invoking my uncle's name, Holmes inclined his head slightly. Mr. Beckwith, I shall be brief. A man was assaulted 2 nights ago in Cheapside, and robbed of documents concerning Lord Everton's will, documents which would have significantly altered the terms in favor of one Reginald Everton. Beckwith's expression did not change. So I've heard. The police came to inquire. I imagine they did, Holmes said. The attacker was identified as Major Alistair Forsyth. You are acquainted with him? By sight, yes. I attended a club dinner 2 years ago where he spoke on the Ashanti campaign. We exchanged perhaps a dozen words. Curious, then, Holmes said softly, that your name appeared on a telegram found at the Eastbourne vicarage, confirming Major Forsyth's whereabouts that same night. A telegram sent from this address. Beckwith's composure faltered. What? That can't be. There must be a mistake. There is, Holmes said coolly. The message was not sent by Major Forsyth, but it was cleverly made to appear so. The signature was forged, but the phrasing delayed by fog, and convey my regards to Miss Aberley, were phrases found in a prior letter written in Forsyth's hand. Someone with access to his private correspondence copied the idiom. Exactly. Someone perhaps with a motive to create a rock-solid alibi for him, while ensuring he remained the chief suspect. I watched Beckwith's knuckles whiten. I had nothing to do with any forgery, he said at last, his voice thin. I knew nothing of any telegram. You must speak to my man if something was sent? Your man, Holmes repeated. Who likely acts at your behest? Tell me, Mr. Beckwith, do you employ a valet with knowledge of telegram codes and a background in penmanship? Beckwith said nothing, his lips pressed into a thin line. I thought not, Holmes said, and turned to go. Thank you for your time. Do remain in town. I imagine Inspector Lestrade will want to verify certain items with you, particularly the precise moment your household sent a wire to Sussex. Back in the cab, Holmes was silent for a time. I could see by the twitch at the corner of his mouth that some part of the puzzle had moved into place. So Beckwith forged the alibi? I asked. Holmes shook his head. He had it forged, but no, I believe he is far too afraid and far too incompetent to stage a crime of such precision. What we saw back there was not guilt, Watson. It was panic. He's being manipulated. By whom? By someone who knows the Forsyth brothers intimately. Someone with access to both their histories, habits, and physical likeness. Someone, I suspect, who stands just outside the current frame of events, but whose shadow we are about to encounter. We had scarcely arrived back at Baker Street when a telegram awaited Holmes at the door, handed to him by Mrs. Hudson, with her usual disapproval of anything that interrupted her afternoon baking. Holmes unfolded it and read aloud, Sir, if you wish to understand the truth behind the Major's misfortune, visit the Eversley Warehouse, Wharf Street, tonight at 10. Come. Alone. A friend. He handed me the slip. And now it begins. Surely, I said, you're not going alone to some dockside warehouse in the dead of night on the word of an anonymous correspondent? Not entirely alone, no, he replied, glancing at the Persian slipper where he stored his pipe. Tobacco. You, my dear Watson, shall be in the alley behind the warehouse with your revolver. He lit a match, his expression unusually grave. There are gains within gains here, and we are now being invited to the inner board. That evening we made our way through the fog-choked streets to the East End, where the gaslights flickered with uncertain strength, and the warehouses loomed like silent sentinels. Holmes moved with a calm I found irritating, while I kept my hand near my coat pocket, the familiar weight of my revolver a small comfort. The Eversley warehouse was dark, its shutters drawn. Holmes stepped forward, opened the side door with surprising ease. It had been left unlocked and disappeared inside without a backward glance. I took up my post across the alley, Behind a stack of empty crates, every muscle taut with anticipation, time passed slowly. The creak of distant pulleys and the occasional splash of water were the only sounds that accompanied the night. Then a faint voice, a scuffle, a door slammed. Moments later, Holmes emerged, walking swiftly. His coat was dusty, and there was a dark stain on one sleeve. "Well?" I demanded, rushing to meet him. "I met our friend," he said, eyes glinting. "Or rather, I met someone paid to deliver a message and a warning." He pulled a folded scrap of paper from his pocket. "You looked for a twin. Perhaps you should be looking for a mirror. Some reflections cast shadows of their own." "Gee, a riddle?" I asked. "A warning," Holmes replied, "and more than that, a declaration. Our adversary no longer intends to hide." As we made our way back to Baker Street, the image lingered in my mind. A twin who may not be a twin, a solicitor whose silence concealed danger, and now a message that hinted at deeper illusion. Holmes had once said the most dangerous criminals were not those who sought gold or revenge, but those who treated crime as art, and I began to suspect we were dealing with precisely that sort of artist. The following morning broke clear and brittle, the fog of the previous days having finally retreated to reveal a London glistening with damp rooftops and puddle-slicked cobblestones. Holmes, though visibly wearied by the events of the previous night, was already at the breakfast table when I descended, a copy of the Daily Telegraph spread open before him and his untouched coffee cooling at his elbow. "There is a certain elegance," he murmured, "in a criminal who declares himself without truly appearing. You see here, Watson, bottom column of page 4. I leaned over and read the small print. Warehouse fire in Wharf Street. Unidentified intruder perished. In blaze. Police believe accident, but foul play not ruled out." "You think this is connected?" Holmes looked up sharply. "The warehouse in which I was summoned hours before goes up in flames not long after I leave it? I find it difficult to believe. In coincidence, when every step of this case has been choreographed." He rose, restless. "Someone is erasing traces, Watson. That man last night was not our adversary, merely a pawn. But even pawns can speak if only they live long enough. Our quarry is cleaning the board." I poured my coffee and watched him pace. "What of the message, 'Look for a mirror'? What do you make of it?" Holmes paused, fingers steepled. "It suggests duplication, but not simply in the form of a twin. A mirror suggests a copy, similar but reversed. Not the same man twice, but the same appearance used twice. Which leads me to consider, could it be that no such brother exists?" "But Forsyth was clear on that point," I objected. "He claimed Gideon Forsyth was real, estranged, and once a fixture in London society." "Yes, and I do not doubt that he believes that," Holmes said. "But what if Gideon Forsyth died years ago or never existed at all, and someone is using that illusion as a cover?" I shook my head. "It feels too elaborate. Why not simply impersonate Alistair Forsyth and be done with it?" Holmes gave a thin smile. "Ah, but then you are guilty of impersonation. If a twin exists, you are simply mistaken identity. It's a fine legal difference, but a profound tactical one." He returned to the table and began writing swiftly on a slip of paper. "To whom are you writing?" "To the Naval Records Office. Major Forsyth served with distinction, but I wonder what they can tell us of his supposed brother. If Gideon Forsyth existed and was known to the War Office, there will be a record. If not, he trailed off before he could finish. There came a knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson, visibly flustered, ushered in a man whose presence immediately set the room on edge. He was of medium build, well-dressed, with a ruddy complexion and a certain officious air, none other than Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard. "Holmes," Lestrade said without ceremony, "I've half a mind to ask if you set that warehouse alight yourself." "Then you'd be wasting half a perfectly good mind," Holmes said evenly. "But please come in. What brings you here so early?" Lestrade seated himself with a grunt. "The man who died in the fire last night, no identification on him. No clear reason he was there, but a constable swears he saw someone matching your description, leaving the scene not 10 minutes before the blaze started." Holmes said nothing. Lestrade pressed on. "I'm not saying you had anything to do with it, but you've stirred a hornet's nest, Holmes. Grimble's office was burgled last night. Someone tried to ransack his files. Luckily, they were disturbed by a night porter, but the files pertaining to Lord Everton's estate were taken." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "And Grimble himself?" Rattled, but unharmed, Holmes exchanged a glance with me. "The criminal grows bold. He's accelerating his plan. And you're no closer to understanding the motive than before. Which is why I'm here," Lestrade admitted grudgingly. "You've a nose for this sort of madness. So far, the only thing I know is that Major Forsyth's been caught on camera, so to speak, doing everything from theft to assault. And yet the man swears he hasn't been in London." Holmes turned to me. "Watson, fetch the file we received from Grimble, the draft of the codicil." I retrieved the thin packet, which Holmes laid out on the table, scanning its contents as though they might suddenly rearrange themselves into sense. "Lestrade," Holmes said, "tell me, has anyone questioned Reginald Everton, the new heir?" Lestrade frowned. "Why would we? The poor fellow's been in France for a month attending to his ailing mother. He only returned yesterday, and from all reports he's as surprised as anyone by the will's amendment." Holmes tapped the paper. "Surprise is easily feigned. Send a man to confirm his travel dates, every border crossing, every hotel stay. If he forged any of it, we'll know." Lestrade muttered something about wild goose chases, but Holmes ignored him. "Now, listen carefully. The heart of this mystery is not the assault, nor even the forged alibi. It is the motive. What if the inheritance is not the end goal, but the lever something to shift attention, to cause conflict? The briefcase wasn't taken for what was in it, but for what it represented. Which is?" I asked. "A reason to frame Forsyth, or someone who looked precisely like him. That frame causes chaos. People investigate. And in that chaos, something far more valuable vanishes." He turned back to Lestrade. "Have any other strange occurrences been reported in connection with Everton's properties? Robberies, unusual tenants, strange purchases?" Lestrade scratched his head. "There was something odd reported by the housekeeper at Everton, Surrey. Estate lights in the windows, despite the house being unoccupied. But by the time a constable arrived, it was empty again." Holmes' eyes lit up. "There's our next destination." Within the hour we were bound for Surrey by train, the tracks unfolding before us like a straightened thread in a tapestry of deceit. Holmes was silent the entire way, though I could sense his mind building and rebuilding the structure of the case with every passing moment. the Everton estate. When we reached it, stood aloof and silent, its gates rusted at the hinges, ivy clawing up the stone facade. The caretaker, an elderly man named Miles, met us at the drive, squinting against the sun. "I don't know what's happening, sir," he told Holmes, "but I've seen shadows in the window twice this week. Once at midnight, once just before dawn. No sign of forced entry." Holmes nodded. "Show us the study." The interior of the house smelled of dust and abandonment. Yet in the study the dust was disturbed. Footprints, delicate, narrow, recent. Holmes crouched and examined the floor. "A woman," he said. "Small feet, light tread. She's been here more than once." I frowned. "A woman? But who—" Holmes was already at the writing desk. He pulled open the drawers with swift precision. In the third, tucked beneath a sheaf of ledgers, he extracted a small leather-bound notebook. He opened it, flipped through several pages, and then smiled without warmth. He handed it to me. Inside, written in a tidy feminine hand, was a name, repeated several times: Gideon Forsyth. Holmes turned to us both. "Gentlemen, it appears we found the ghost, and she may yet lead us to the man wearing his face." Holmes stood motionless in the musty stillness of the study, the notebook in his hand as if it were a butterfly pinned in a case. Outside, the overgrown lawn swayed gently in the wind, a quiet rhythm that only seemed to heighten the gravity within. The room. I leaned over his shoulder to examine the entries. Gideon Forsyth, the name, had been written in various styles, some in flowing cursive, others in quick, almost agitated scrawl, as though the writer had been rehearsing his signature. Below one such repetition were the words, "He promised. If he fails again, I'll take what's mine." Holmes closed the book with a soft snap and slipped it into his coat pocket. "This," he said, "is no idle scribble. This is the hand of someone for whom Gideon Forsyth is more than a memory." Lestrade looked unconvinced. "A woman writing a name proves little." "It proves she was here," Holmes replied coolly. "It proves she was using this room without permission, and it proves she has reason to believe that name still bears weight." He turned back to the desk and picked up a half-melted candle from a silver holder. Paraffin, recently burned. Yet the dust suggests no other source of heat. Has been used in months. She's not simply a trespasser, Lestrade. She's been hiding here, observing. I turned back to the window. The grounds outside stretched into a narrow copse of trees near the back of the estate, where a gardener's shed leaned on one angle, like a man too tired to stand straight. She could still be near, I said, and Holmes was already moving. The three of us crossed the back garden quickly, skirting bramble patches and half-buried paving stones. The shed door was ajar, swinging slightly in the wind. Holmes stepped forward and placed 2 fingers gently on the edge before pushing it open with the utmost care. Inside, the air was thick with old wood and soil. A lantern sat on an overturned crate, the wick trimmed but unlit. A pile of wool blankets was spread across an old bench, and a canvas bag had been tucked beneath it. Holmes crouched beside the bag and pulled it open, revealing a compact mirror, a small pistol of continental make, and a folded paper that he unfolded and read aloud. "Do not contact me again unless you have the final ledger. He suspects already. If he speaks to Grimble, we're finished." He glanced up. "Watson, This Ledger Grimble mentioned no such thing, did he? No, I replied, only the will codicils. Then either he's holding back again, or he doesn't know what he had. The tenement we arrived at was grim, even by London standards, a soot-streaked facade, with warped window frames and a creaking door. A child darted past us, barefoot and shrieking with laughter, chased by a dog with half a tail. Holmes entered, without knocking, ignoring the suspicious eyes of the woman on the landing who stirred her soup with a knitting needle. The second floor landing creaked underfoot. He stopped before a black-painted door and tried the knob. Locked? He knelt and withdrew a length of wire from inside his cuff. "I don't suppose this is strictly legal," I muttered, "nor is fraud, assault, or impersonation. Yet our quarry seems unconcerned by legality." The lock clicked, and we entered a small room heavy with perfume and the scent of lavender oil. A mirror stood against one wall, ringed by theater lights. On the vanity below it sat a row of cosmetics, brushes, and several items of male grooming razors. Pomade, a military-style mustache comb. Holmes examined the table, lifting one item after another with his fingertips. "She's been transforming." "Someone in here," he said. "Over weeks, perhaps months." There were papers, 2 scraps of ledgers, torn envelopes addressed to various aliases. On the dressing table, a crumpled theater program bore a name written in pencil, M. Forlani. Holmes opened a narrow drawer and found a small tin box. Inside it were clippings, old ones, yellowed from age. Articles from Italian papers. Headlines translated into English. "Bank clerk vanishes with bonds, suspected of embezzlement. Woman acquitted in forgery, trial evidence destroyed." In fire, Holmes handed one of the articles to me. "It appears Miss Barty has made a career of misdirection. This isn't her first attempt at manipulation via manufactured identity. Only now she's added prosthetics to her repertoire." There was a noise from the hallway of footstep. Holmes froze. A shadow passed across the threshold. The door handle turned. He motioned to me to step to one side and crouched just behind the hinge. The door swung open slowly, revealing a tall man in a dark overcoat. I saw for the briefest moment the unmistakable face of Major Forsyth, or so it seemed. Before the man could react, Holmes moved like lightning, seizing him by the wrist and twisting him down into the floor. I sprang forward to help. The man struggled briefly, then slumped. Holmes pulled away the collar of his coat and revealed a thin line of adhesive residue trailing along the jaw. He peeled it back, and the face changed. The features beneath were narrower, younger, unfamiliar. "Who are you?" Holmes asked coldly. The man spat at the floor. "I am no one." "No," Holmes replied. "You are a mask worn by someone else, and I intend to find the one who fitted it." He turned to me. "Fetch Lestrade, and quickly. I believe we now have the thread that will lead us out of this web and back to its spinner." I left Holmes crouched over the masked man in Celeste, barred his flat, and made haste down the dim stairwell, pushing past a cluster of curious onlookers drawn by the scuffle. The night had thickened again outside, damp and close, wrapping London in its cloaking murk. I found a hansom on the corner of Lambeth High Street and directed the driver to Scotland Yard with urgency. By the time I returned with Lestrade and 2 uniformed men, Holmes had bound the intruder to a dining chair with what appeared to be one of Miss Barty's own silk scarves. The fellow no longer resisted, though his eyes flicked warily between Holmes and the window, as if still considering flight. Lestrade entered with his usual brusque energy, taking in the cosmetics, the scattered articles, and the figure before us in a glance. "Is this the phantom?" he asked, walking around the seated man. "He certainly doesn't look much like Forsyth now." Holmes stood. He looked more like him an hour ago. The adhesive was fresh. A near-perfect facial replica constructed by Claude Varnier, worn for the purpose of misleading nearly everyone. Lestrade gave a low whistle. "And who is he, then?" Holmes turned to the man. "This is your opportunity. You may offer your name now, or the Yard will extract it by other means, and I dare say with less civility." The man remained still, but the tension in his jaw betrayed inner turmoil. Finally, with a trace of defiance, he muttered, "Michael." "Forlani," Lestrade pounced. "The same Forlani who fled Florence under indictment? We had a circular on you 2 years back embezzlement, wasn't it?" Holmes nodded. "Indeed." He and Celeste Bardi crossed paths in Italy. "It seems they've formed a partnership of criminal fabrication. She engineers the illusion. He plays the role." Forlani gave a bitter laugh. "You know nothing about it." "On the contrary," Holmes said, "I know precisely enough. You impersonated Major Forsyth to assault Grimble and retrieve a briefcase likely containing ledgers tying Miss Bardi to certain shipping frauds from her time abroad. You wore the disguise again in Cheapside to plant witnesses and consolidate suspicion. Then, once the codicils disrupted the Everton inheritance, your intention was to vanish into the shadows, leaving Alistair Forsyth ruined." Forlani clenched his fists, but said nothing. Lestrade approached him. "What about Bardi? Where is she?" "She'll be gone by now," Forlani sneered. "You'll never find her." Holmes's expression sharpened. "That may be true, but your usefulness to her is finished. She left you here to be caught, wearing a face that no longer protects you. You were the decoy, Forlani. You always were." The words landed with precision. The man's bravado faltered. "She said it would all be settled tonight," he said, as if to himself. "She said we'd sail before dawn." Holmes looked at Lestrade. "Have the docks searched. Every outbound passenger list. If she means to leave, it will be under a false name, but she will not travel light." "Sure have. The ledger. That's her prize." Lestrade nodded to the constables. "Take him." As Forlani was led from the flat, Holmes turned back to the vanity, retrieving the remaining letters and newspaper clippings, gathering them with the same care a botanist might give to a poisonous bloom. I watched him in silence until he straightened. "You said she was the one who wore the mask," I offered. "But she never needed one, did she?" "No," he replied, "because she worked from behind the illusion. She built it, directed it, but never starred in it. She played the audience, us all along." We returned to Baker Street, well past midnight, and Holmes moved directly to the hearth, where he stood gazing into the fading embers. I waited for him to speak, knowing the shape of a conclusion was forming in his mind, just shy of clarity. "Watson," he said at last, "what is the value of identity?" I blinked. "Value?" "Yes, to be believed, to be seen, to have a name that opens doors or invites trust. Forsyth's face was his currency. She took that from him and spent it recklessly." I nodded slowly. "You believe she intended to ruin him?" "Not only that," he said. She intended to replace him, in the eyes of the law, the military, and even society, to fabricate a history, rewrite the future, and eliminate the real man in the process. Not just a fraud, a deletion. I shivered. But to what end? Holmes turned. She wanted something sealed under Forsyth's name. A trust, perhaps. A deed? Something she could only access if he were removed and his double accepted in his place. And if that failed, then the scandal alone would suffice to destroy him, leaving no one to contest her final move. Which is? He crossed to the writing desk and withdrew the notebook we had recovered from the estate. He flipped it open and held it toward me at the back of the book. In that same feminine hand were the words, Everton House, North Gallery. Behind the portrait, Holmes met my eyes. She was searching for something, and I believe she found it. We were at the Everton estate again by first light. The caretaker greeted us with a groggy curiosity, and Holmes waved away the need for explanation. He made straight for the North Gallery, a seldom-used hallway lined with ancestral portraits and smelling of damp linen and dust. There, Holmes said, pointing to a portrait of a woman in Regency dress, her eyes soft and watchful. He removed the frame from the wall with surprising ease. Behind it, embedded into the plaster, was a narrow cavity, a recess, with a false backing. Inside was a leather-bound folio, wrapped in oilskin. Holmes opened it with the reverence of a priest unveiling scripture. Inside were dozens of papers, contracts, transfer deeds, and one final document, a revised deed of ownership, transferring control of the Everton shipping concern to an unnamed beneficiary. At the bottom, faint but visible, was the signature of Lord Everton himself, and a seal dated just 3 days before his death. Unregistered, Holmes murmured. Unwitnessed, but real. And had she destroyed the codicils, no one would have known this existed. He exhaled slowly. This was her prize. Not inheritance, control. Lestrade arrived half an hour later, his face a mix of triumph and surprise. "We found her," he announced, "trying to board a steam packet under the name Clara Beaufort. Had the ledger in a traveling case, as you said. She put up no resistance." Holmes gave a faint nod. Because she'd already lost. Forlani failed. The estate was stirred too soon. And now her hidden lever, he tapped the deed, is in our hands. Lestrade looked down at the documents. "What do we do with this?" "We give it to Grimble," Holmes said, "and we let Forsyth decide whether to bury it or expose it. The law will hold her for the forgeries, the fraud, and the attack. But the deeper scandal well that belongs to the Everton family. Outside, the sun rose over the estate, burning through the last remnants of fog. I followed Holmes out onto the drive. "You've done it again," I said quietly. He gave a wan smile. Holmes tapped the edge of the crate thoughtfully. "There's more to this. A woman hiding here, awaiting someone who's evidently promised results. A missing ledger that inspires fear. And a name, Gideon Forsyth, that is spoken like a ghost. But perhaps belongs to the living." Lestrade huffed. "She's clearly an accomplice. Likely sent to retrieve something Grimble had. The codicils were a distraction." "Or the beginning," Holmes said softly. "The codicils upset the inheritance. Structure, which could have provoked anyone with something to lose or something to gain." He rose and looked out through the narrow gap in the planks. She's gone, but not far. No carriage marks, no recent horse tracks. She came here on foot, or perhaps by bicycle. We returned to the house, and Holmes spent several minutes examining the footprints in the study once again. "Note the pattern," he said, pointing to a dusty imprint near the doorway. "Heel worn, toes narrow. Continental make, probably Italian. Watson, remind me, didn't Grimble once work a case involving European import fraud?" I nodded slowly. "Yes, something to do with shipping tariffs. A scandal involving falsified cargo manifests." Holmes' eyes sharpened. "And such documents would require meticulous record-keeping, a ledger, for instance. Watson, it is possible that the briefcase stolen from Grimble's office contained not only the codicils, but the very records that could expose a much broader fraud, which would explain why someone risked assault and impersonation to retrieve it, and why someone else, perhaps our lady trespasser, was willing to wait in an abandoned house for its return." Lestrade cleared his throat. "Holmes, I must say I prefer crimes where people shoot each other for money. This business of ledgers and mirrors and forged names gives me a headache." "You lack patience, Lestrade," Holmes replied. And you underestimate the complexity of greed." We returned to London just before dusk, the train rocking gently as the countryside faded into soot-streaked brick. Holmes spoke little during the journey, lost in calculation. At Baker Street he barely paused before turning to me. "I must see Forsyth again. He may have told us the truth, but I suspect he omitted a key piece of his past. Something or someone he hoped we wouldn't find." Major Forsyth was waiting for us in the reading room of his club, his fingers clenched around a brandy glass, as though it were a lifeline. He stood as we entered, his eyes bloodshot. "I've just come from speaking with the solicitor," he said. "They've officially begun proceedings to suspend my commission. The scandal is spreading." Holmes took a seat opposite him and steepled his fingers. "Major, we have reason to believe your brother Gideon is being impersonated, perhaps even manufactured. Before we proceed further, I must ask you plainly, is there any chance your brother is dead?" Forsyth looked down at his drink. "I don't know. We quarreled bitterly in '91, after the death of our father. He left the country. I heard he'd gone to Cairo, then to Monte Carlo. I received a postcard, unsigned, but the handwriting looked familiar." "You've never seen him since?" "No." Holmes regarded him steadily. "And what of women? Was your brother involved with anyone who might now have reason to seek revenge?" Forsyth hesitated. "There was someone. A woman named Celeste. Bardi. She was intense, Italian, I believe. Gideon met her during a summer in Florence. She followed him back to England, but he abandoned her shortly after. I heard she tried to file a claim against him, fraud, deception of some kind, but it was settled quietly." Holmes nodded. "Celeste Bardi, the pieces begin to cohere. Do you think she's involved?" Forsyth asked, lowering his voice. "I think," Holmes said, "that a woman with a long memory, a grudge, and knowledge of your family's affairs would be uniquely qualified to manufacture the illusion of Gideon's return." Forsyth blinked. "You mean there is no Gideon?" Holmes rose. "There is a Gideon Forsyth, yes, but I suspect the man seen attacking Grimble was no more your brother than he was you." "And if that's so," I said, "then who was he?" Holmes retrieved the small mirror from the bag we'd found in the gardener's shed and handed it to Forsyth. Whoever it was, he matched your face down to the scar on your temple, which leads me to one unsettling conclusion. Forsyth looked at Holmes, confusion deepening. Which is? Holmes' voice dropped. That your face, your very identity, has been borrowed by someone with the means to duplicate it, not by accident, not by blood, but by design. The room fell into silence as the implications settled. I could almost feel the moment Holmes connected the final thread. His posture shifted slightly, and his gaze turned inward, as though the answer had presented itself in a sudden flash. "We must find Celeste Bardi," he said at last, "and not tomorrow, tonight." We left the Major at his club with a warning to speak to no one and to stay put under any circumstance. The fog had returned to London as we stepped into the night, thin and colorless, trailing through the gaslight like lace. Holmes moved quickly, with the long-limbed urgency I had seen only when he felt the net tightening, when the truth, hidden behind illusion, was preparing to show itself. "Celeste Bardi," he said as we hailed a cab. "Not a common name. And if she is who I suspect, not a woman who tolerates invisibility. She has operated just outside our view, Watson, and now we must bring her into the light." "Where are we going?" I asked as Holmes gave the driver an address in Soho. "To the offices of Claude Varnier, theatrical costumier and prosthetics artisan. He specializes in alterations of appearance, disguises, makeup, facial molds. If someone has copied Forsyth's face, it's a near certainty Varnier has touched the process." The cab rattled over cobbles, wheels splashing through shallow puddles, and pulled up in front of a narrow two-story building, wedged between a tobacconist and a locksmith. His sign in peeling gilt read, "Claude Varnier Theatrical Transformations." The front window displayed powdered wigs, false beards, and a mannequin with half its face molded in wax. Holmes didn't knock. He pushed the door open and entered, his eyes sweeping the cluttered space like a predator scenting game. Behind the counter, an emaciated man with a white cravat and fingers stained with glue and pigment looked up from carving what appeared to be a false nose. "Varnier," Holmes said by way of greeting. "Put down the nose and answer truthfully. Has anyone asked you in the past fortnight to construct a prosthetic resembling Major Alistair Forsyth?" The man blinked, his lower eyelid twitching. "I, Mr. Holmes, I am not the police," Holmes said. "But you may prefer them if I find you uncooperative." Varnier swallowed and looked away. "I made a faceplate," he muttered. "I didn't know the name. I was given a photograph." "Very precise instructions." Holmes stepped forward. "What kind of instructions?" "Scar on the temple, thinning hairline, left nostril slightly wider." They paid in cash. "Foreign bills Italian, I think. The woman was Italian, too. Cold eyes. Said she needed it for a play." Holmes tilted his head. "Did she give a name?" "No, but the man who came with her signed the work order Charles Gideon. I thought it odd. Gideon as a surname, you know. She did all the talking, though. He just stood there, silent, watching me work like I was fixing a clock. Do you have the mold?" Varnier hesitated. "She took it. Insisted it be destroyed once finished. I tried to keep the template, but she was very particular. Threatened me. Said if I so much as breathed a word." Yes, Holmes waved him off. And you breathed a word because I asked the right question. Good. When did they last? Return. A week ago. He came to adjust the fit small corrections. She said the next appearance had to be perfect. He was to walk into a room, and even his own brother wouldn't know the difference. Holmes' eyes gleamed. Thank you, Mr. Varnier. You've been most helpful. I suggest you leave town for a few days, perhaps Brighton. Somewhere with sea, air. We were back in the cab and moving before Varnier had locked the door behind us. Holmes sat silent for a long while, until I finally asked, so it was a disguise. Yes, constructed with precision and worn with intent. That man who assaulted Grimble, he wasn't Gideon. He wasn't even related to the Forsyths. He was a stranger with a mask and a motive, to frame Alistair. To become Alistair, if necessary, Holmes corrected. Or Gideon. The name was merely a vehicle. What matters is that this woman, Celeste Bardi, has built a phantom, and she has used it to disrupt an inheritance, threaten a solicitor, and, I suspect, misdirect a financial investigation into something far larger. The cab turned and rumbled toward the river. Where now? I asked. To Celeste Bardi's residence. Varnier mentioned foreign bills. The Italian embassy maintains a register of residents under observation. I made enquiries days ago, Watson. Her name came up, tied to an address in Lambeth. Yes, but at what cost? A man nearly erased, a criminal mind nearly triumphant. The truth, Watson, is a fragile thing. And yet, I said, you've brought it back into the light. He glanced toward the gallery window. For now. But there will always be others, like her, those who wear faces not their own, and trade in shadows. It is our task, I suppose, to unmask them before the audience applauds. And with that, Holmes turned toward the waiting cab. The case of the identical suspects drawing toward its final act. We rode back to Baker Street in silence, the kind of silence Holmes favored when a case approached its close, thoughtful taut. With aftershocks. The morning traffic had begun to stir, iron-shod wheels clattering over damp stones, but Holmes appeared oblivious, his gaze fixed on the passing rooftops, as if still scanning for hidden patterns. I had seen that look before. Not satisfaction exactly, but the gaze of a man reviewing his own calculations, seeking fault lines no one else could see dot as we dismounted before our door. I could not help but ask, "Do you believe she would have succeeded, Holmes, if we hadn't intervened?" He paused on the threshold and regarded me with a gravity that took me aback. "Given one more week," he said quietly, "perhaps less, yes. The forgery of identity, the theft of inheritance, the manipulation of institutions. Celeste Bardi nearly reinvented the truth. What she lacked in scruples, she compensated for with precision." Inside, Mrs. Hudson met us with her usual reproving glance, though it softened slightly as she handed over the latest post. Holmes flicked through the envelopes without interest until one, with a wax seal and the distinctive blue paper of the Admiralty, caused his hand to still. He opened it and read the contents slowly. Then, without a word, he passed it to me. The letter was brief. "To Mr. Sherlock Holmes, concerning your inquiry into the service records of Major Alistair Forsyth and one Gideon Forsyth. No record of a Gideon Forsyth, twin or otherwise, exists. In any official capacity under naval or army commission from 1880 to present. Any claim of such a person appears to be unverifiable. Yours, in confidence, LT, CMDR, Edwin Trelawney, Records Office, Admiralty House. I looked up. So the brother never existed. Holmes nodded. Not officially, which suggests one of two things. Either Gideon was entirely fabricated by Major Forsyth himself, unlikely, given the consistent references from others, or he lived his life outside of the official sphere, unrecorded and untraceable. You think he may have existed, I said, but was erased? Holmes folded his arms. Perhaps not erased, perhaps hidden. I have seen many families who lock away their scandals in silence. A child disowned, an affair covered up, a name left unspoken in polite society. It is possible that Gideon Forsyth was real, but not legally acknowledged, an illegitimate twin, a disgraced relation, or even a double who once served a private purpose. But the man we saw, I said, recalling Forlani's expressionless eyes beneath the peeled mask, he was no Forsyth. No, Holmes replied. He was a cipher used by Barty to resurrect the myth of Gideon. She did not need the real man. She only needed the shadow of him. He turned away and stoked the fire with a poker. The flames flared briefly, casting long flickering shadows on the walls. The face was borrowed, the name was stolen, and the truth, he sighed, the truth was assembled from pieces. A Frankenstein of deception. We had barely sat to a late breakfast when another knock came at the door, firm, deliberate, the knock of someone whose presence demanded notice. It was Major Forsyth. He looked thinner than before, but composed. His eyes carried the weight of sleepless nights, and his military bearing was intact despite the storm that had blown through his life. I came, he said, because I need to understand fully what she was after and how you uncovered it. Holmes gestured to a chair. Sit, Major. You are owed the truth. He recounted the sequence in clean strokes, how Barty had located Forsyth's likeness in Forlani, how Varnia had crafted the prosthetics, how the stolen briefcase had been the smokescreen for a much older fraud involving the Everton estate. The ledger hidden behind the portrait, the silent housekeeper who missed nothing but said less, the escape that never quite succeeded. Forsyth listened without interrupting. When Holmes finished, he remained silent a moment longer. She never loved Gideon, he said at last. She wanted him to marry her, yes, but it was always about money. In Florence, she talked of nothing else. Gideon was impulsive, prone to excess. I was the elder. I cleaned up the debts. The embarrassment I paid her to leave. Holmes tilted his head slightly. Do you believe she ever left? Forsyth smiled grimly. Not entirely. She followed my name through society papers. She knew when I was in India. When I returned, I received unsigned letters for years accusatory, unhinged. Then they stopped. I believed she'd forgotten. Holmes shook his head. She never forgot. She planned. She created a narrative with your face at its center. Had she succeeded, the shipping titles would have passed to a name she controlled. With Grimble discredited and you destroyed, there would have been no one to contest it. Forsyth leaned forward. And the man, Forlani, was he truly nothing? More than an actor? He was more than that, I said. He was complicit, willing. He would have become you entirely, had the timing allowed it. But in the end he was abandoned. She always planned to discard him. Forsyth stood. Then I owe you both more than thanks. Holmes gave a small shrug. You owe us only your silence, Major. Let her face her charges. Let the courts handle what remains. But let the name Forsyth, whatever it once meant, disappear from public entanglement." Forsyth nodded and left us, the door closing with a quiet finality. Holmes watched the fire for a long while after. Then, finally, he said, "Do you remember, Watson, what the message said that night at the warehouse?" I nodded. "You look for a twin. Perhaps you should be looking for a mirror." He turned to me, the faintest smile at his lips. "We looked for a man who resembled Forsyth and found one, but it was the mirror we misunderstood. Celeste Barty did not find a twin. She built one. The reflection was not natural, it was manufactured." "She built him out of resentment," I said. "No," Holmes corrected softly. "Out of calculation. Resentment was merely the fuel, but the engine was control. That evening I walked through the streets of London with a strange weight in my chest. The city bustled as ever newsboys shouted headlines. Hansoms rattled past and ladies picked their way across cobblestones under parasols. But I could not shake the image of a man made in another's image, walking among us as if born to the part. Back at Baker Street, Holmes was at his violin again, the bow drawing out a long, melancholic note that lingered in the air. He paused only once to say, "A mask, Watson, is not always worn over the face. Sometimes it is sewn into a life." I said nothing more, and the music resumed elegant, complex, and unerringly precise. The days that followed passed in a curious lull. The Morning Post brought no more blue-sealed letters, and Holmes, though outwardly at rest, was not idle. He spent long hours stretched upon the settee, with his fingertips pressed together, and his eyes fixed on the ceiling, as if waiting for some final thread to vibrate in the invisible web still hanging faintly over the case. I, for my part, had resumed my rounds, grateful to return to patients who complained of indigestion and chilblains, rather than criminal conspiracies and stolen identities, but the calm was not to last. On the third evening, as we sat before the fire, Holmes with a monograph on Venetian ciphers, and I with the latest strand, a sharp knock split the quiet. Before Mrs. Hudson could reach the door, it opened to reveal Inspector Lestrade. His face unusually drawn. Holmes sat up at once. "Well, Lestrade, I gather from your expression that our story has found an unexpected postscript." Lestrade stepped inside and removed his hat. "It's about Celeste Barty." "Ah," Holmes said softly. "She has escaped." Lestrade blinked. "How did you?" "Because a woman like Miss Barty does not allow herself to be caged by common bars," Holmes replied. "How was it done?" Lestrade exhaled heavily and dropped into a chair. "Poison, concealed in the hem of her corset lining. Some kind of rare extract. When the matron left her cell to fetch the breakfast tray, she was still breathing. When she returned, she wasn't." I set down my book. "Suicide?" "Perhaps," Lestrade said. "But there's no note, no message. Just a scrap of paper, folded small, in her palm." Holmes extended his hand wordlessly. Lestrade produced a sealed envelope and passed it over. Holmes broke the wax and unfolded the note inside. "A masquer's. Not removed, it is shed. The audience never sees it fall." C.B. Holmes stared at the words for a long time. Then he folded the note and slid it back into the envelope. "She was telling us goodbye," he said, "or perhaps reminding us she was never truly caught." Lestrade shook his head. The prison's in uproar. No visitors. No way she could have obtained the poison without help. But it was quick and efficient, almost rehearsed. Holmes rose and walked to the window, staring out at the blurred lamps glowing through the fog. You see, Lestrade, she was never building a future. She was crafting an ending. That ledger, the inheritance, those were not her escape. They were her stage. And the only way to preserve control of the story was to end it before the curtain dropped. Lestrade gave a low grunt. A madwoman. No, Holmes replied. Not mad. Just unwilling to let the truth be dictated by anyone else. After Lestrade left, Holmes remained by the window, unmoving. I poured him a brandy, set it by the hearth, and waited. At length he turned to me. Watson, there are cases where the facts can be pinned like butterflies, clean, ordered, undeniable. But there are others where the truth is not fixed. It's fluid. Impressionistic. I nodded. This was one of the latter. She died as she lived, he murmured. Enigmatic, controlled, and unseen by anyone she didn't choose. The following morning brought a single letter addressed to Holmes in a hand we both recognized. It was from Grimble. Mr. Holmes. After much consideration, Major Forsyth has asked that the Everton deeds and the accompanying ledger be deposited with a private trustee. The codicils will stand, but the deeper matters, those tied to the shipping irregularities, will remain. Sealed. He asks only that Miss Barty's name not appear in public record, to preserve what little dignity remains for those who once knew her. He thanks you. As do I yours. Osric Grimble handed the letter back to Holmes, who laid it atop the mantel without a word. And so, the affair closed, not with a trial nor a headline, but with a silence. Celeste Barty vanished into death as she had lived in. Shadow, carefully, deliberately, and on her own terms. The newspapers reported only that a foreign suspect in a financial matter expired in custody. No details, no scandal. And for once, Holmes made no effort to correct the record. Weeks passed. The leaves yellowed and fell. Winter approached. Life resumed its steady rhythm. It was not until mid-November, as Holmes and I strolled through Kensington Gardens, that I asked him a question I had long left unspoken. "Do you believe," I said, "that Gideon Forsyth ever existed?" He did not reply at once. We walked in silence beneath the thinning trees, the air brittle with chill. "I believe," he said eventually, "that Celeste Barty believed in him. And in the end, belief, when sustained by conviction and craft, can take on a weight almost equal to fact. And the man in the mask, a tool, chosen, shaped, and discarded. But even tools leave impressions, Watson. We may never know who he was before Forlani, just as we may never know if there ever was a Gideon. That is what she left us." I nodded. "An enigma, a reflection," he corrected. "Faint, altered, but unmistakably human." We walked on in silence, and I could not help but think that Holmes, for all his logic, carried this case in a different part of himself, somewhere closer to the heart than he cared to admit. For the mystery of Celeste Barty was not one solved with a single deduction, but one that had unfolded like a play whose meaning shifted with each act. And so ended the case of the identical suspects, with no twin, no clear villain, and yet in its own twisted symmetry a complete circle. The face of Alistair Forsyth reclaimed, the inheritance left intact, and a name Barty forever inked in the margins of our memories, half legible, never forgotten. It was nearly a fortnight after that quiet walk in Kensington Gardens when the final stirrings of the case re-emerged, not in the form of a letter or visitor, but in the subtle shift of Holmes himself. He had returned to his usual pursuits, with apparent vigor consulting on a forgery in Chancery Lane, assisting the Royal Botanic Society with the theft of rare orchids. But I noticed a peculiar intensity beneath the surface, as though something, unfinished, continued to tug at the edge of his consciousness. He spent more time than usual at his desk, combing through directories and registries, requesting documents by messenger from shipping offices, private banks, even foreign embassies. At first I presumed it a new case, but he said nothing of it to me. Not until one gray afternoon, when he closed the door to the sitting-room with particular care, set aside his violin mid-note, and turned to me with a quiet finality. "Watson," he said, "what if we were wrong about the ending?" I lowered my newspaper slowly. "Wrong? About Barty?" He nodded. "About her exit, specifically. About the poison, the suicide." But Lestrade confirmed it himself, the body, the circumstances? Yes. Holmes waved it off. A woman was found in the cell. A body was buried. The prison records were completed. But let us reconsider the only fact that mattered to her. Control. You recall what I said, that her final act was rehearsed? What if, Watson, it was performed? The suggestion froze the room around us. You believe she is still alive? I believe, Holmes said evenly, that she orchestrated her own death as thoroughly as she constructed Forsyth's impersonation, and I have evidence to support that belief. He crossed the room to his desk and withdrew a bundle of documents. The first he laid before me was a copy of the coroner's report. Note the peculiar phrasing, facial similarity consistent with identity. No mention of fingerprints. No independent dental confirmation. Merely a prison matron's word. And a coroner's haste. The face, I said slowly. Could it have been altered? Holmes tapped the second page, a list of visiting deliveries to the prison that week. You'll observe here a parcel from a Miss C. Beaufort, a name Barty used before her arrest. It contained clothing and toiletries, never opened, never examined. Among them, I suspect, was a prosthetic, perhaps even one of Varnier's. Early trials, enough to pass in poor light for the real woman. And the poison? Extracted possibly from one of the medicinal soaps, Holmes said, but not ingested by her. Swapped, perhaps, with a bribed inmate. Someone of similar build. A woman facing a longer sentence offered freedom of a sort in exchange for silence and cooperation. I stared at him, and the body buried in Barty's name was someone else entirely. He nodded. She vanished behind the performance, Watson. Shed the last mask. No one has seen her since. I rose and paced. But why would she fake? Her death, if she had already lost, her plot failed. The inheritance went to Reginald Everton. The ledger was recovered. Holmes's expression tightened. Because she was never after the Everton estate. Not truly. That was her diversion. What she wanted, what she still wants, is buried deeper. He retrieved a third document, this. One, a ledger entry from an Italian banking house. A transfer made 3 days after her supposed death. A dormant account in Trieste, long unused, suddenly activated. withdrawn in full, under the name of Clara Beaufort. I stared at the paper. She had a second plan. She has one still, Holmes corrected. She vanished, yes, but only to act again. I do not know where or when, but she will not remain hidden. A mind like hers does not disappear into domesticity. It reinvents the game. And what will you do? I asked quietly. Holmes folded the documents and returned them to the drawer. I will wait. The days passed, and though Holmes resumed his customary routine, there was a new weight to his silences. It was as though he had accepted the incompleteness of the case, but not its defeat. I began to suspect that for him, Celeste Bardi had become something more than a criminal adversary. She was a reminder of how close the world of illusion could press against reality, of how fragile identity truly was. Winter deepened, and on Christmas morning a package arrived for Holmes with no return address. Inside was a small velvet box and a folded card. The card read only, "Your audience applauded." But the curtain never truly falls. In the box was a silver mask delicately sculpted, like the kind worn at Venetian carnivals. Not theatrical. Symbolic. Holmes held it for a long moment in his hand, then replaced it in the box and shut the lid. He did not speak of it again, but I knew from the shift in his step, from the way he returned to the violin that evening, not with detachment, but with purpose, that he was already preparing, that somewhere behind another name and another city, the game had resumed. And in the quiet corner of Baker Street, we waited. For the mask to slip, for the illusion to falter. For Celeste Bardi, who had once written, "A mask is not removed. It is shed to cast one final shadow." We waited for her return. The final revelation arrived not with a scream or a chase, but a letter modest in appearance, folded once, and tucked into the Morning Post among bills and circulars. It bore no return, address no seal, only Holmes' name in a hand neither Bardi's nor entirely unfamiliar. I watched as he opened it slowly, his eyes narrowing over the brief message. "There is a man in Constantinople wearing the face of an English major. He speaks no English, answers only to Gideon, and trades in secrets. Ask no questions. You already know the answers. See." Holmes read it twice before folding it again and setting it down beside the toast. "Well," he said after a long moment, "there it is." I stared at him. "You believe it's real?" "I believe," he said, "that it is true enough to warrant examination." He rose, crossed to his desk, and retrieved from its drawer the silver mask sent weeks before, the one he had placed there with ceremony and left untouched. He held it up to the light now, turning it gently. It glinted like water, faceless and perfect. "Celeste Bardi has written her epilogue," he said, not with confession or contrition, but with a taunt, a final challenge. "She knows I cannot resist it." I said nothing, for it was true. There had been a subtle but unmistakable shift in Holmes ever since her escape had come to light, an energy that had not been resolved by uncovering her methods or motives. She had become more than a case. She was a cipher within a cipher, and even in absence she had drawn Holmes into her orbit. "But what does it mean?" I asked quietly. "Is this Gideon a man she made, another mask worn by someone else, or, he is real," Holmes said. "The original, never dead, only hidden. Perhaps he surfaced at last. Perhaps she found him, or created him from what she remembered. He turned the mask once more, then placed it gently back into its velvet box. "She wanted me to keep looking," he said, "so I shall not. That will be my answer to her." I was surprised. "You're leaving it?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Not everything deserves pursuit, Watson. The mask may reappear. So may she. But if she believes I am watching every port and border, she will stay buried. If, however, I place the matter down genuinely, she may rise again, and when she does, I will be ready." He returned to the window and stood for a long time watching the street below, where snow had begun to fall quiet and unremarked over the rooftops and gas lamps, softening the city's edge. "And if she does not?" I asked. If this was truly her farewell, he turned back, his face unreadable. "Then we may regard her as one of the rarest adversaries we have known, one who understood disguise not as deception, but as freedom, and whose vanishing was not an ending, but a choice." The fire crackled softly behind us. Outside, the bells of St. James chimed the hour. In that moment, the fog that had lingered since the case began seemed at last to lift, not just from the streets of London, but from the heart of the matter. Celeste Bardi had not simply worn masks. She had become them reflections that shifted, shape with every light, every gaze, every assumption. And though Holmes had stripped away each layer of her plot, the final truth, the real face, remained elusive dot as he returned to his armchair and picked up his pipe. I knew the case was closed, though not solved in the conventional sense. It had become something more than a crime, a meditation on identity, on illusion, on the perilous dance between performance and reality. Holmes struck a match and spoke softly, almost to himself. "Sometimes, Watson, the most perfect disguise is to be exactly who they expect you not to be." And with that, the case of the identical suspects passed into the pages of our private chronicles unsung, unfinished but unforgettable.